I'd like to talk about combined events myths, following up from the video series that I've been doing so far. So I've been hearing and reading up on, well, what a lot of people think about combined events as a structure. Um, this video is being recorded on the 20th of October 2023, so quite a lot of athletes are um, going into their winter series of training. We're in the UK. I'm in the UK and based in Southeast London, and so it's fairly traditional and typical um, now that combined eventers athletes are going through what's called a winter phase, an indoor season preparation, um, various other things. And I really wanted to talk about why is that, possibly challenging it, giving my take, seeing how that relates to combined events, all that kind of stuff. So if I look at the kind of finish line, if you like, the high ending senior combined event athlete. So let's park the whole developing athlete, juggling school and all that business. And let's say you're working towards becoming a fairly successful, well, a successful, the very top senior combined event athlete. Um, and so you can talk about what's appropriate for the age, development model, all that stuff. Um, but from looking online, I've found various articles. Usually, when I find an American high school coach or a university, when they talk about how they train for decathlon or heptathlon, stuff like that, they almost give a rundown of microcycles, um, phases of training, what they do in a typical week, how they periodize their year, all that kind of stuff. And don't really go much into the principles of why. They don't really justify why they've done it, why they've chosen to do that. It's all fairly prescriptive. And if you're a bit unsure about how to train for combined events, it feels like you're just copying what other people are doing and you don't really understand why they're doing it. Um, and also, this isn't a detailed session plan, a microcycle planning document by all means. It's just a rough list. Um, and it's almost like it's supposed to be so that coaches to coaches can understand, like, okay, that's a general structure and they can tweak it for their athletes um, as and when. I've also read articles of just you have to be doing X in Y time, or you have to be running so fast or jumping so high. Standard one is you have to be really fast. You have to be fairly springy. There's all these kind of performance outcomes rather than looking at any kind of skill development, although that is mentioned in some cases. But in terms of like what standard you have to be for decathletes, heptathletes, I see the whole this standard or go home kind of thing. Um, what's quite interesting is that fairly recently, in the last 10, 15 years, I have found quite a lot of articles of even high school coaches, university coaches in this country, um, America, Europe, saying essentially that there is a lack of understanding in the event. I don't think they necessarily mean the coaches, but I think that they mean the athlete training for them. And so, you know, how to put together a training program that works for the athlete and to be able to justify why they're doing it is quite a critical thing. Um, Now, there's various justifications, and the justification is only really as strong as your ability to reason and how much logic or the level of logic you possess, I guess. But I think the other myth that comes up quite a lot is um, because decathlon, heptathlon are a series of events, a particular combination of events in a particular order, and it's quite a strain on the body, not only physically but mentally learning the skills and the amount of training you need to do. It's almost an unchallenged given that you need to put in a lot of work over a long period of time. And it's fairly difficult for a school athlete to train to be a combined event athlete. Um, it's seen as a late developing sport, so you can put in the work as a school kid, whatever, as a youth, but it's generally expected that you don't succeed until you're X years old. Um, insert statistic here. So there's quite a lot of preconceptions, and I'd argue misconceptions around the sport, things that are just assumed. And the whole purpose of this video is to challenge that, really, get you to think about other things, or rather see it in a different way. And there is hope. Um, and to briefly summarize all the things that I found is that the first thing is a biometric approach. Uh, this is not uncommon. Many performance coaches are like, well, if you look at X years, then the decathletes have all been around 24 to 28 years old. They've all been a certain height, certain weight, and so on. And so my question would be, how useful is that for the young athlete or the teenager you're dealing with now? And they don't have control over any of that. Um, it's actually quite dangerous, I'd say, to say that to a kid, that you need to be a certain weight. Um, it doesn't exactly help their self-esteem if you say to them they've got to be a certain height either. Those are things that are largely out of control, or rather, weight probably is out of age. Weight and height. Weight is probably something that is most likely to be within their control, but it's a very dangerous slope to be making children hyper aware of their own weight, and really you're moving down the realms of like a weight controlled sport like boxing, um, or Formula One, where there's not necessarily a weight control, but if you're a small light driver, then it helps and all that business. But weight category sports, there's a whole host of issues there. It's supposed to promote fairness, but I've seen all kinds of horror stories of athletes starving themselves. When I say athletes, I mean sports people. I don't mean athletics athletes. So I think you just have to tread very carefully with the whole, you know, uh, this is a biometric that we're using to measure potential success. I'd stay well clear of it. A typical combined of athletes should be doing X sessions a week, and then they proceed to list a table. As I've shown before, that's fairly common. Um, but I'd argue that's not a particularly great idea, because it's not very specific and catered to the athlete. And we'll come over to um, we'll explore that in more detail. But I think the main question is: suppose it's right. Suppose an athlete does need to have, and then the prescribed list and so on. What if the athlete coach setup doesn't have the time, resources, facilities to enact a similar plan? What then? Um, so it's all very well. You can list like, right, you're training 7 days a week. Sometimes you're doing multiple sessions in a day. What if an athlete has school? What if an athlete has other commitments? It's not just a case of you prescribe this and fail. I've known plenty of athletes that have juggled multiple sports, multiple pursuits like music, dance, various other things, and they've still been successful in athletics, and they've developed, remained injury free, and they love the sport. So I think planning isn't just a case of here's an impressive looking plan, deal with it. I think you still have to the smart targets. You still have to think of the realism, realistic nature of it. You can't just say it's this or bust. And combined event coaches, from what I've seen, tend to be let's get the volume done. And it seems to be we'll get there by covering all bases rather than a specific plan. We'll come on to it soon. Um, Another thing that happens quite a lot is multiple coaches are needed to develop the athlete and ensure they get the best technical help. I feel like I've banged on about this tons. The whole, multiple coach model versus single coach model. Uh, I totally understand why people are in tune with the multiple coach approach. It makes sense, or at least I can see how they rationalize it, that you've got the best in their particular field helping. And I'll talk about that model in the next couple of slides. But my question is, and again, if let's assume that that's right, that multiple coaches is the way forward. So, the argument is, let's suppose that is right. Then what do you do if you can't find all these coaches, or you can find them, but they're not local, or sometimes in this country they can't or even won't work together? maybe they're too busy, maybe they've got a rivalry, maybe they share different athletes that have fallen out, and all of a sudden you're engaged in this kind of social politics, and before you know it, you're thinking more about how to please other coaches and to manage your time seeing them, and actually thinking, right, I'm gonna work on XYZ today, or and just generally getting on with training. Um, I feel like the American system has got this perfected in the sense that even at high school, they have faculties of staff that deal with this, and they have regular meetings. But from what I can see in this country, all the athletes with multiple coaches, um, either they're regularly talking to maybe I'm wrong, but maybe they're regularly talking to each other. They have a lead coordinator coach that's conducting regular meetings, has a good overview how the athlete's getting on. There's various forms of assessment, if you like, where they're checking and monitoring progress. They're checking in with the athlete, all of that stuff. And that's fine, but we'll talk about the pitfalls of that soon. Other things, a lot of combined events is physical conditioning dependent, and the athletes on TV don't seem to be technically that good. Um, physical conditioning is, physical conditioning is the most important thing to develop at this stage. But is it, well, sorry, physical conditioning is important, but is it the most important thing to develop at this stage for your athlete? And there's a subtle difference there. Sorry for the distraction. So what do I mean by that? I mean, yes, if you're not physically conditioned to do the heptathlon, pentathlon, octathlon, decathlon, then yeah, it's not going to go particularly well. But I think you need to understand there's other factors to it as well. You could be in the greatest shape of your life, but if your health is up the wazoo, so you're super duper fit, but you've got a cold, that's obviously going to impede performance. If you're missing the equipment, for example, you've forgotten your pole, that's obviously not going to be good for pole vault. If you've forgotten your other kit and equipment, but I think I'm probably being a bit facetious there. But I think more to the point is what I'm saying is technique, skills, movement patterns. That's kind of where I'm going. That often is seen as a decathlete's weakness. So this whole idea of like they're not particularly good um, at anything, um, but they're okay at everything. So they've got moderately good movement skills, not particularly honed in anything, but they're pretty good at everything. And I would challenge that um, because there has been a trend, at least over the last 10 years, from what I've seen, a power of 10, especially at the younger year groups, under 15s, under 17s, and so on, um, is that combined eventers who have been exceedingly good have also been topping the UK rankings in several other events as well. That's happened lots of times, but I mean, if you go back historically to Daley Thompson in the 80s with an 8 meter plus long jump, he was clearly the best in the UK at the time. And I think at one point his long jump actually would have won the individual Olympics in the same year he did the decathlon. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's potentially, or it would have definitely medaled. And so it is possible to be world class in a handful of events and be a decathlete. Um, the overall point score is what matters. And again, you can be world class in the heptathlon and world class in individual events as well. I think the main thing for heptathletes, combined event athletes, is their overall score is what matters. I mean, if you look at Nafi TM, I can't remember what her PB is for high jump, 202, 201, 203, something like that. It's low twos, and that's exceptional high jumping. You could be an individual high jumper for that, and not disgrace yourself at the world Olympic level for women. So yeah, and it's just worth thinking about. I don't think combined eventers. Um, I wouldn't say given the respect, but I think you have to understand that there is a lot of potential for good combined eventers out there, but a lot of them deviate. I think there needs to be some kind of shift that people don't do combined events because they suck at other things. I think it's more they do combined events because they're good at everything. Okay, the real good combined eventers are good at everything, and it's not a case of whether they specialised or not. And yeah, this is the most pervasive one. It must be so difficult to juggle all the different events. Um, and what I'm about to show you is the argument. So, are combined events just a combination of events? Is a decathlon is it worth training for 10 separate events? Is heptathlon just 7 events? And that may sound like a silly question, but the more I think about it, the more I justify it in my own way, the more I look online at other articles which I'm about to show you. It seems to be that the leading theory is that it's you've got to see it as one event. You've got to see decathlon or heptathlon or octathlon or whatever as a single event with many parts for sure. But I think to crack the beast is what I'm about to show you. So here is what the vast majority, from what I can see, of combined event athletes in this country, um, in a few other countries as well. Although I do find mainly Americans, from what I've seen, there are a few exceptions. Harry Mara, who was Ashton Eaton's coach, and his wife Tissia Eaton, great heptathlete as well. But the American collegiate system for sure is many coaches. And from what I see, the setup seems to be, and again, I'm not speaking about every single setup. That's not what I'm saying. But the general flavor that I seem to see is that there's a lead coach or coordinator. Maybe that lead coach actually does some sessions. Maybe that they take a step back and it's purely a coordinator role. But then there's coach A, coach B, coach C that they work with, and each of those coaches do event specific training exercises essentially. So they'll take them through the hurdles, for example, or they'll take them through shot put, the throws, or and javelin, or you might get a coach for either, and then high jump and long jump and so on. And on the completely compartmentalized side of things, you could have a coach per event, which is absolutely bonkers as far as I'm concerned, but people do it. But you generally, what I've seen to find is like a small group of 3 or 4 coaches. They cover most of the events, and then on top of that, apart from the event-specific exercises, you get non-event specific exercises. So you might have a strength and conditioning session, weights, other supplementary exercises, sprinting, medicine ball work, hill runs, all that other kind of stuff. And then in the background, just permeating, you've got some kind of athlete coach review. So not only are the coaches speaking to each other, you've also got the athletes speaking to the coaches, obviously, and you've got the coaches speaking to parents, significant others. There's um, there's target setting, planning, competition structure, all that business. And again, not every combined event setup is like this. Some of them missing parts, some of them got a few extra parts, but as a raw basic skeleton, this is kind of what I'm observing, to be perfectly honest with you. And so my question would be, what does this remind you of? And to me, it absolutely hums of our current education system. It seems a lot like school. So instead of a lead coach, you've got a head teacher, senior leadership team, and then you've got individual subject teachers. They'll give you subject specific learning. They'll then give you guided practice or study sessions or homework. So what does that mean? It could be homework club, extracurricular clubs, revision sessions with peers maybe, or in or around school. And then there's subject teacher review time. So you might have phone calls home from parents, you'll have marked books, you'll have parent teacher meetings, head teacher messages home, letters home, all that kind of stuff, reviews, correspondence. And to me, the multi-coach approach completely screams of the education system. Uh, and so I understand why people get it. I mean, it makes sense from an educational point of view, where there's subject-specific things like English, French, maths, science, where you need a specialist to be able to teach them. And I completely understand that. It seems to make sense for a lot of people. And so instead of being purely a cognitive memory retrieval or problem solving exercise like it is at school, it's more of a biomechanical motor skill type issue with sports. But the analogy is fairly strong, I'd argue, um, at this point. And so the follow-on to that is, do you actually want your training to be like school, like education? I don't know if you've noticed or whether you're aware, but in the last 10, 20 years, me personally, being in the teaching profession, I've noticed a massive shift, massive paradigm shift in school. It's no longer even how I remember going to school, and I went to school in the late 90s, early 2000s for secondary school. Um, and so I think it's worth bearing in mind that school, the Department of Education, and I'll leave all these links in the description, but their case for change, which was released in 2017, I believe, literally stated the very first paragraph, the very first sentence: England schools can do better. Right now, that's the Department for Education. The buck stops with them. They are responsible for it. And the very first sentence for their report on the case for change and the importance of teaching is England schools can do better. And now, personally, if you are handling your athlete, um, and the setup is modeled very similarly to a setup that has been working a lot longer than athletics coaching, education in this country, um, every single one of these educators is degree, university um, educated, whereas I can't claim that for athletics coaches. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, like these teachers have spent years in education. They've gained qualifications that have left them in debt, that kind of thing. Whereas athletics coaches, bless them, they've gone through the procedure of being a qualified coach. And yes, they've spent a lot of money over the years invested in athletes because essentially they're volunteers for the most part. Unless they're a professional coach that's willing to make money off of athletes, which is fine. That's a separate discussion. Um, but yeah, teachers and coaches are professional, but in very different ways. Um, and so they are professional. There are similarities, there are differences, but I think as long as you're aware that the multi-coach approach does mimic or echo a lot of what the current education setting is. In this country, it's not diabolical. Don't get me wrong. It's massively improved even since when I went to school, and it's massively improved in the grand scheme of things. Like, for example, in the last 100 years. But the Department of Education still recognises that there's scope to improve. Um, and also, schools have a legal responsibility and duty to provide a level of education en masse. So schools can have hundreds of students in them, best part of 1,000 sometimes in some cases. And they do all these classes, 20, 30, maybe slightly more students at a time. Okay. And students don't have a choice by and large of what they're studying. Um, they do slightly to somewhat when it comes to GCSE options. But when it comes to primary school, nope, they don't have a choice. The curriculum is there for better or worse. Again, that's probably an argument for another time, but they don't. Up until year 9 options, I'm guessing, then yeah, it's largely fixed. And so the question would be, does this reflect your athlete's circumstances in their group? Are they in a massive group of 30 within, essentially a school of thousands, and it's regularly tracked, and you have parent teacher meetings and all that stuff? And then when you think about it, I think and it's no dishonor to the athletics coaches, because a lot of them have full-time jobs, and they're doing this off their own back and whatever. But if you were to be as thorough as a school with the monitoring, the marking, the parental, and all that stuff, it is a second job. It really is. I'm doing it myself, and I think I'm not giving anywhere near as much feedback as I would do at school at all. And it's taking my life away. It really is. Um, and so you just got to be really careful that, do you want to put your athlete in a system that echoes the educational system? I'm not bashing it. I think it's great. I mean, I work as a teacher, don't get me wrong, but there are flaws. And I don't think recreational sport, or even sport that's turning professional, is quite the same as mandatory education for developing athletes. I think they're two very different scenarios, and so my gut instinct is saying that you shouldn't just blindly apply the same model. But again, that's something you need to reflect and think about. So fine, I hear, well, I don't hear you, but suppose you say, right, okay, so you keep bashing this multi-model stuff. I mean, how, this single coach stuff, no one knows how to do all these events, blah, blah, world class, and which is fine. You can think that. I will possibly counteract that with what's stopping you learning how to be then. You need to have a growth mindset. You need to be able to be constantly researching how to improve your craft. I think you'd do that even if you was an individual coach rather than a combined events coach. And to me, a combined events coach is separate from all the other events. And the reason for that, and this is kind of my segue into that, is all of these athletes here at one point were considered pretty world class in what they do. So on the top left, you've got Jessica Ennis-Hill. Jess Ennis is, when I was at university, what she was renowned as. Was the British record holder before Katharina Johnson-Thompson took it from her. And again, Olympic gold medalist for heptathlon. In the middle, you've got Stefan Holm. To me, arguably the best high jumper of all time, even though he's not the world record holder. He has the effective height jumped above head world record holder, standing at 5'10" and jumping to, I want to say 240, 242, while only being 180 centimeters tall. So best part of 60 odd centimeters above his head height, 2 feet. It's just impressive. You've got Mondo Duplantis there doing pole vault, world record holder. The bottom left, Ryan Krauser. In the middle, Daniel Stahl. And in the bottom right, one of the best well, they're all some of the best throwers of all time. But in the bottom right is Johannes Vetters, 95, 96 meter thrower, I think, or 90, I can't remember, in the mid-high 90s. Phenomenal athlete. But yeah, so what do all these positions have in common? Because I mean, to me, before this, you've got run-ups and setups for throw, and after this, you've got releases and other things. But for me, these are all the critical moments of the performance. You're just about to throw, you're just about to take off of the ground, and this is kind of where it all starts. So I've paused all of these videos at this certain point in time, and what do they all have in common? Well, to me, there's quite a few things. For a start, there's clearly one foot that's in contact with the ground, extending, the triple extension, as some people would say, and that's denoted by the white circle here, and that's clearly pushing into the ground. The other leg, well, it's flexing, and in the case of the throws, it's flexing against the ground, it's pulling down, and in the case of the jumps, it's pulling up. So the knee is rising, but the heel is kind of kicking up. You're pulling upwards, if that makes sense, or pushing up. It doesn't particularly matter, but it's definitely some kind of flexion. You're flexing about the knee, flexing about the hip joint. And so that's denoted by the red circles. So you're like, okay, fine. There's not much similarity there. You can see how the white and red circles are in different positions doing different things. The next thing is the hip and trunks, or the hips and trunk has driven past the pushing foot, that white circle, in every single one. So the hip position has driven past the white foot, driven past the white foot. Doesn't matter if it's a jump, doesn't matter if it's a throw. You have driven your hips and arched your torso in a powerful position, upright, with a slight rotation backwards in the sagittal plane. So it's there. It's that push up. It's that sudden drive, that hip thrust, chest bumping to the sky drive. And then the final thing, the head positions, usually in line with the trunk, but they're never looking down. You'll see a lot of athletes, especially when doing long jump, they'll be looking at the board and they'll jump with their head down, or they're running and their heads are flopping about all over the place, but their heads are usually in a controlled position in line with the trunk. And so here, 6 events, we've got 6 variations of what I call the Care Bear stare. Now, the Care Bears, essentially a NAF cartoon in the 1980s, but there's still the cartoon going on now. So I'm sure some younger kids might get it or whatever. But essentially the Care Bears, whenever doing the Care Bear stare, where they they kind of Care Bear stare and they push their chest up and hips forward, and their magical little tummies release magical beams of stuff, and then they save the day. And whatever it was, I can't remember. It was 30, 40 years ago for me, but it doesn't matter. The point is that power position, that pushing through the floor, the hips driving past the pushing foot of contact, the other foot doing some kind of flexion, or the limb of the other leg doing some kind of flexion, whether pulling it on the ground or pulling up into a driving knee position, and the head staying tall. This is all signs and symbols to me of the Care Bear stare. And this is why I'm kind of insisting on, you've got to see combined events as less as training for a single event and more training similar movement patterns. And so by looking at combined events as, a series of specific movement patterns, but just applied in different ways, if you train that specific movement pattern, then you're ticking off multiple events in one session, and you are maximizing the bang for your buck. You don't want to be spending 20 minutes on 6 sessions when you could spend 20 minutes on one session and cover all those events, those 6 events, whatever it is. So working in isolation, just doing one event at a time, and seeing combined events as collections of events to be mastered individually is not the same as spotting patterns, seeing combined events as one whole event with components that are similar, and those components you work to absolute buggery. You get them absolutely nailed. And the other thing I've noticed is yes, you period multi events combined events coaches that don't look at power movements, they tend to periodize their training primarily on specificity. Uh, they do obviously with technical aspects as well, but it's with physical conditioning as well, and they taper and all the rest of it. But generally speaking, in this country, in the UK, when it gets colder, coaches think, oh no, we can't do full run-up stuff. It's too cold. We might get injured. Oh no, we won't do full jumps. It's too cold. We might pull a tendon or rip a tendon or whatever. And you start to see this more like, yeah, let's go to the gym. Let's put some work in. And definitely I find that some coaches, the specificity just dials way down, and we'll come on to it in a second, but the intensity goes up, the specificity goes down. Whereas I would argue that the power events, you always need to be the power movement approaches, you always need to be working technically as best as you can. And it's the intensity that you dial in, whether up or down, increase it, decrease it, depending on the time of the year. And it's not a case of, oh, we're not going to do full run-ups, or we're not going to do jumps. We're going to do some light plyos or some mobility activation stuff and all this other kind of what I'd consider woolly, but I will talk about in a second what I really think about them. But always training specifically, but the intensity is the dial to control, catering to the athlete and their performance, ability, fitness. So, yeah, you might do full run-ups, but if you can only handle one or two in a session because they're 13, 14 years old, fine. 13, 14-year-old athletes can handle 2 or 3 full run-ups. They could probably handle a lot more, but if you see a dip in performance, it's no problem stopping there. They don't need to push themselves. I think it's very athlete dependent. And so I believe the paradigm shift needs to be away from event coverage or modular jigsaw approach with multiple coaches giving. We haven't even talked about the feedback. I mean, suppose they have regular meetings. If I have a power movement approach and there's one coach, I can give feedback immediately, straight away, all the time. I don't need to wait to have a meeting with other people. I can just give it straight away. There's no way the having multiple coaches approach can give feedback quicker than one coach just goes bam and tells you straight away. It's a no-brainer. Like, I don't see how you can relate. So with a combined events coach just doing power movements, then really to me there's 3 power movements. There's the advanced triples extension variations. So that essentially covers all the field events. And to me, I I call them the Care Bear stairs, because whether you're kind of twisting while coming up or just coming up, or doing various different things. They're all variations of that kind of hip thrust, one foot pushing down, the other foot pulling. Um, and then the other two power movements really are hurdling and sprinting. If you can sprint, you can hurdle, and you can do all those Care Bear extensions, then all of the events are just applications. They really are. If you've got all these three things cracked, you are a cracking combined eventer. Like not even remotely half bad. You are very good. So here's some articles. The 1989 World Athletics overview on the long-term planning of combined events. So quite old, but again, this is the World Athletics stance. Is they've said that combined events in athletics, so decathlon, heptathlon, should not be regarded as mere putting together of 10 or 7 events, but rather as a single integrated event. Okay. Now I've interpreted that as it's one single event. You need to train for that single event by looking at movement patterns that are the same, that are important. You need to look at it as blah, 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 blah. Whereas to me, if you are having a lead coach and multiple coaches, you are flying in the face of that and you're essentially saying, right, actually, no, it is a whole event, but actually, I want to break it down into parts and let people deal with that. And to me, the German word is Gestalt. And Gestalt essentially means where the whole package together is greater than the sum of the parts, and you completely lose that Gestalt effect if you do that. Um, so yeah, World Athletics is of that view. There's also the NSA Roundtable of Combined Events seminar that happened back in 2013. There are loads of people on that. There was Harry Mara, who's the coach to Ashton Eaton. There's Tony Minicello, just off the back of Jess Ennis winning the London 2012 Olympics. There was Erky Newell, who was Olympic champion for decathlon, and they all more or less said the same things. Again, I'll post the links in the discussion, but going back to the biometrics of you have to be a certain height and whatever. Tony Minicello, to be honest, as a coach to a heptathlete who is considered by some to be too small, she is by far the smallest heptathlete to ever win a world or Olympic um, title. Definitely in the last 30 years, it's 1990. I'd have to look back further to confirm, but I'm pretty sure she's the smallest. I tend now to put little store in anthropometric guides, i.e., you've got to be a certain height, certain weight, that kind of thing. The things I look for are excellent running speed and a good high jump. So he's isolated high jump there, which is not surprising considering Jess Ennis won English schools for high jump. But anyway, if you have those two basic elements, the rest can be taught. The downside is there is a lot of quick athletes drawn to sprints when they should be in combined events where they would have a real future. And yeah, I think that echoes back to the whole, you know, combined events is seen as the, oh, you only do combined events if you suck at everything and you don't particularly shine at anything, you're just kind of okay, so that'll do for you. There's actually a lot of talented sprinters that could jump, and if they could jump, they can jump high, they can jump long, they can jump over hurdles, and then it's a case of teaching them how to throw. And they're explosive, so that's one big piece of the puzzle fitted. And so Minicello, when asked, while it's true that there's a level of compensation in each athlete's technical models, essentially saying that combined event athletes can't be as good as individual specialists. I disagree with that, but we'll carry on. There is also the sense of a basic core model. So power movements, what we're talking about. What do you consider acceptable, not acceptable when it comes to variance from the core technical models? Okay, so Tony Minicello essentially said you can't beat good biomechanics. It's the first point. A good technical model leads to a consistency when trying to produce results. I must say, in fairness, it's easier for heptathletes to have a better technical model as they have fewer events and can spend more time on the development for each one compared to decathletes. Now, this immediately tells me that although Tony Minicello was the only coach for a while for some of these decathletes and he got other people in the multi-coach model, he clearly was not a power movement coach. Otherwise, his decathletes and heptathletes would have both thrived. And I think the proof's in the pudding that he had Jess Ennis, and in terms of his decathletes, well, the decathletes were nowhere near as successful as Jess Ennis, and that's not a discredit to them, but there clearly seems to be a favouring of heptathlon, and it's going back to the whole plate juggling thing. And to be a truly good combined events coach, you need to say it's not a plate juggling exercise, it's a power movement uh, exercise. And power movements you can do once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. And you can argue, well, you're not going to be a good decathlete if you only train once a week. I totally agree. But once or twice a week is achievable for a young athlete that's just getting into the sport. I don't want to argue with empirical evidence, but essentially, I've just had an under 13 boy who trains once a week. He's been training once a week for a year, and by the time he got to the top of under 13s, he was the best in the UK. He broke his club record, and he's the best in the UK with a 2-minute 59 800 meters. And so, for in context, out of 2,000 points in 5 events, he only got 67 points from an 800. So that means he got best part of 1,930, 1,940 points off of 4 events, which at that age is very, very good. And again, it goes back to what I was talking about other athletes where they've not been doing 800 stuff. And I've talked about this at length, but young pentathletes, some of them feel like they're very, very good because it tends to favor 800-meter runners at that age. And 800-meter runners are quite fast. They can probably jump to some extent. And if they're fit and they're fast, they can kind of wangle the other events. And shot put isn't that much of a technical problem, and they can punch out a half decent shot put, and then that's done. Long-term development, I don't care what their 800 is. That's something that can be worked on. It's possibly the easiest thing to be worked on, to be perfectly honest with you. Skill acquisition is number one. And I've experienced it many times where athletes have been absolutely rubbish at the 800, and then we've waited until they get a bit older, and then under the UKA athlete development model, where their energy systems are a little bit more mature, then boom, we can do the appropriate training. It doesn't take long, and their times just slip, just completely get decimated. They're running PBs, and it's just a no-brainer. You don't need to be charging a kid at cross country 800 meters all that while. There's more important things, and it's the power movements. So the power movement approach, as I said before, is scalable. You can do it once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. You just do it. It doesn't particularly matter. It's completely catered towards the athlete. I actually kind of feel that for developing athletes under 13, under 15, under 17, novice, just before youth, that maybe 2 or 3 times a week, a good 2 or 3 good sessions a week is probably about right. It's manageable. I don't need to liaise with other coaches. I can just get on with it. It's really good in the sense that the kids the young athletes understand what's going on. It's a good balance between consistent but not overly repetitive because of all the variations. I also find that there are a lot of athletes in the seniors in this country particularly that I feel do not have the techniques. For example, if you're running 100 meters in 10.6, 10.7, you should not be struggling to break 8,000 points. Again, that is really prescriptive, but I think that's a key indicator that there is some kind of technical issue, i.e. you're either not jumping or you're not throwing, because you clearly can run. So I feel that even this basic power movement approach is so important. It doesn't matter if you're a seasoned professional or whether you're a novice. The drilling in the power movements again and again and again is a massive fundamental that needs to be gotten right. And it's transferable. So what do I mean by that? Well, I've listed, and again I'll put it in the description, but I've listed a bit of cognitive neuroscience there, various experiments of block-based learning, so doing lots and lots of things in a block versus interleaving, where it's essentially called mixed practice. So you mix things up, and the verdict seems to be in that for long-term memory retrieval, interleaving is far superior, but it takes longer. Whereas blocking has better short-term results, but when it comes to long-term memory retrieval, it's absolutely horrendous. And it goes on to say that, well, long-term retrieval could be compared to instinctual muscle memory or having a stronger neural pathway when it comes to, you know, athletes performing a technique. And really, that's what you want. You want something where an athlete under pressure, bang, the technique just clicks together. You want those strong neural pathways when it comes to technical movements. It works under pressure. It works when you put more effort in. It works when you're relaxed. I can't stress enough how those neural pathways are just so important. And so if it's scalable, it's manageable, and it's transferable. And when I mean transferable, as in like when you do the training, it transfers to what you want to do, then that's so effective. That's what you want. You want to go to training, and then what you do at training impacts how you're going to compete. That's what you want. You don't want to go to training and then all that training actually doesn't do anything and you're back to square one. So, what does a power movement training series look like in practice? Well, the session aim could be something really generic, as in to reinforce and develop the three main power moves: hurdling, care bear stair, and sprinting. The session structure can be any way you like. It honestly doesn't matter. I'd probably start with hurdles as a good warm-up exercise, and then I'd probably do some kind of, jump, throw, or a throw and the jump. It doesn't particularly matter. Some coaches are really, really, really hung up on sequential events and synergistic events. So sequential means you do them in the order in which you practice. So for heptathlon, it would be hurdles, high jump, shot, 200, then long jump, javelin, 800. For decathlon, it's 100, long jump, shot put, high jump, 400, 110 hurdles, discus, pole vault, javelin, 1500. And yes, I get what they're saying, but under the umbrella of power movement training, it's all of the same anyway. It doesn't matter what order you're doing it. You're focusing on key movement skills that are all transferable against all the other events. Um, and because you're doing certain muscle movements in certain ways at certain ground contact times and all that other stuff, I tend to find that a jump, a throw, and some hurdles is like the right mix of different ground contact times, um, different variations of the Care Bear stair. It's getting sprinting in there, that plyometric ability. It just does everything. And you'll find that athletes don't get particularly tired about that kind of stuff. If anything, they can just keep doing that for 2 hours. Like if you do a 40, 35, 40-minute hurdle session, a 30, 40-minute high jump session, a 30, 40-minute javelin session, or maybe put the javelin first if you feel like they need a bit of a rest into high jump, even though technically if they're doing javelin right, it should still be a high intensity exercise. And then you could finish with some sprints. Like you will find there's a lot of, it's not as bad as it sounds. I think it sounds like they're working super hard for 2.5 hours, but you'll find these athletes, they adjust to it. And if they want rest, then don't say, bro, you must be doing it. Just let them do it in their own time. And so I'll expand on that. Another example of the power movement, to me, the power movement approach being so successful is because if we remember from our coaching days, UKA, they talk about Anatoly Bondarchuk's Transfer of Training and Sport volume, the exercise classification hierarchy. Now, a pinch of salt, I get it has its limitations. I am like an 80% fan of it. I agree with it for the most part. I think there's some limitations. For example, I think the exercise classification hierarchy is incredibly useful if the athlete is completely fluent in the technique. If they're still learning, I don't think it's that entirely applicable. I think there's a psychological element that some people can't get over. For example, most people want to practice things slowly under a different energy system rather than doing things fast. This hierarchy would indicate that you learn best or it transfers best when you do things as quickly as possible that replicates the event, and that's not necessarily true. But there are a lot of good takeaways here. So the highest is the event itself that leads the best transfer to the training. There's CE, which is competitive exercise. So that's, it replicates the competitive energy, competitive movement and uses the same energy system. There's SDE, specific development exercises, which replicates part of it. It's a bit of a spectrum, but it replicates part of it, or it's done under some kind of resistance and uses the same energy system or physiological system. SPE, specific preparatory exercise. So, we're not using the same muscle movements anymore, but we're still working the same energy system. And then GPE is the general preparatory exercise, which doesn't use their muscle movement or energy system. And you might argue, well, what's the point of the GPE then if it doesn't do either the energy system or the technical movements? And well, people do things for fun, believe it or not. Some people use it for regeneration work, so recovery. Some people might need to be in that zone if they're coming back from an injury. I think as long as you can identify what exercise you're making your athletes do, where it falls under that, you can kind of go, well, okay, it's impacting training in this way. That's the main thing. So I'm going to say, I love a good metric. So this isn't true for all for combined events coaches, whether it's the multiple model or the single combined events coach. But here's my reasoning if you're not entirely convinced anyway. So let's say, for example, you start the winter season. So on the left, you've got a coaching system where you've got multiple coaches, and on the right, you've got just a single combined events coach. So on the left, you might have a mixture of GPE, needles down to SPE and then SDE. They're big chunky blocks because you're with a single coach and they're going through all of the exercises. So GPE might be the warm up, it might be mobility exercises, it might be walkover drill, or funny like hurdle drills, but not actually hurdling, like weird, like not step overs, but just funny non-hurdling drills, if that makes sense, where it doesn't replicate the movement and it's almost aerobic. And so to me, that's firmly in the GPE section. You might argue that SPE, well, they're working quite hard. They're starting to do some lactic, alactic stuff. And the SDE might be they're jogging over hurdles or whatever. Whereas the combined events coach is clearly working in SPE, SDE. They don't have time to mess about. The boxes are a bit thinner, but they're more frequent because they're doing the same thing each week. And so when it comes to actual events covered, they're doing the same thing, but it's more frequent but less intense, if you like. If we start looking at the pre-season, things are starting to ramp up now. So it's towards the back end of the winter, maybe some multi-event coaches that are in groups are kind of going, well, okay, it's time to step up for the competition. We've now done the pre-season, if you like. We're now into the heart of winter training. Things are ramping up. You might have some competitive exercise in there. You might have like, one or two full run-ups at the end, or some full, glide throws in the shot. You might have 5-6 hurdles from block starts, which is ideal if you're training for the 60-meter hurdles indoors. There's just, again, it's fair. It's a lot bigger. They're blockier because you're just seeing them once a week or maybe twice a week, and it kind of tapers like that. It's starting to get more specific, but it's still hovering in the SPE, like general development. I find that individual specialist coaches love SPE, love SDE, because it's kind of like building the athlete, and it's kind of like we're going to really make you a well-rounded athlete. Whereas a combined event athlete coach, we're probably starting to do the competitive exercise stuff, but we're still working, probably doing less work. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I might be seeing these athletes 2 or 3 times a week, whereas a coach setup, that athlete might be training every single blooming day. And then the summer outdoor season, oh yeah, like you're doing nothing but competitive exercise. You might be doing a bit of top up on your energy systems here and there, a little bit of GPE for regen, but you're pretty much in competition mode. And then for a combined events coach, if it's not SDE or competitive exercise, why are you doing it? Like literally, why are you doing it? And so on the surface of it, the blocks or the volume, if you like, is fairly similar. And you'd probably argue that the multi-coach setup is more well-rounded. Um, and the combined event seems a bit weird, and there's no GPE, and it's like what? Uh, but when you look at the transfer of training, i.e., actually replicating the movements, you'll find that the power movements come into play here. And now, when you just look at the hierarchy where only the skills are being replicated, the combined events power movement just starts to pull away. And then when you look at the actual competitive exercise, the highest thing to transfer over, it just becomes abundantly clear that you're going to have a greater transfer